Welcome to Fireside Chat, a devotional that takes place in the Fireside Room at Falls City First United Methodist Church in Falls City, Nebraska. This devotional follows the Revised Common Lectionary, a 3-year devotional tool which gives 4 scriptures each week. If you read all 4 scriptures each week, over the course of the 3 years, you will have read a vast majority of the Bible. Each week we will read the scriptures, and Pastor will give his first thoughts upon reading the scriptures, as well as any other interesting information there is for the week. We thank you for joining us, and we hope you find something meaningful and powerful in today's devotion. Each week I read from the Common English Bible, a recent translation by multiple Protestant denominations, including the United Methodist Church. Welcome in for Fireside Chat on the 5th Sunday after Epiphany, February 6th. The color is still green. We are still ordinary time. And for this Sunday, there's nothing special in the liturgy here, although it is, for most churches, going to be the first Sunday in February, and so therefore it will be Communion Sunday in many Methodist churches, as well as some other denominations. So if you are able to get into a church or attend online, make sure you get your communion if that's your tradition. The readings for this week, the Old Testament reading is Isaiah chapter 6, verses 1 through 8, or it can be continued on to verses 9 through 13. The song reading is Psalm 138, which is in the United Methodist Hymnal at 853. The epistle reading is 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 1 through 11. And the gospel reading is Luke chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. Both of those are a small skip from where we were last week, but in the same book. Our Old Testament reading today is Isaiah chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. You can add on 9 through 13, which would be the rest of the chapter. I've looked ahead, as usual, with those kind of optional verses. And I do think that these are very different readings that may be tied together, but I will stick with the 1 through 8. Let us read. In the year of King Uzziah's death, I saw the Lord sitting on a high and exalted throne, the edges of his robe filling the temple. Winged creatures were stationed around him. Each had 6 wings. With 2 they veiled their faces, with 2 their feet, and with 2 they flew about. They shouted to each other, saying, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of heavenly forces. All the earth is filled with God's glory." The doorframe shook at the sound of their shouting, and the house was filled with smoke. I said, "Mourn for me, I am ruined. I'm a man with unclean lips, and I live among a people with unclean lips. Yet I have seen the King, the Lord of heavenly forces." Then one of the winged creatures flew to me, holding a glowing coal that he had taken from the altar with tongs. He touched my mouth and said, "See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt has departed, and your sin is removed." Then I heard the Lord's voice saying, "Whom should I send, and who will go for us?" I said, "I'm here. Send me." This is actually the second time I've had to record this. There was a problem with the first recording, so these won't be my first thoughts, although it's kind of what I can remember. But this week has a lot of call stories, and it has a lot of talking about, I think, the different ways God calls individuals. This is Isaiah's call story. If you remember back to last week, I think it may have been the week before, we had Jeremiah's call story. And I mentioned there that a lot of pastors identify with Jeremiah's call story. A few pastors identify with Isaiah as well here, though not as many. Maybe that's just me. I identify with Jeremiah more than Isaiah. But here we see a couple of things that I wanted to make sure I pointed out. The first is that the primary verse I think we think about is that last verse that was read, verse 8, where God says, "Whom shall I send?" And Isaiah pops up, "I'm here, Lord, send me." It's been immortalized in one of my favorite hymns in our hymnal, "Here I am, Lord," where we kind of have the congregation having that, right? God is saying, "Whom shall I send?" And with all this good news of the verses, and then the congregation is responding in the chorus, "Here I am, Lord, is it I, Lord, I've heard you calling." And I think that when we do that and we focus so hard on verse 8, sometimes we forget that the first 7 verses exist in this call passage. And in those verses, we see Isaiah trembling. We see Isaiah in fear. We see Isaiah not respond first off with, "Here am I, send me." He responds first off with, "Woe is me, mourn for me, for I've seen God." I think that too often in the church, we forget the early parts of call stories, and we only remember the end when they're answering the call. We preach to answer the call and answer the call, and there comes a result of that people either feel inferior for their calling, and they're not sure about it, or they feel inferior themselves because they didn't immediately pipe up and say, here am I. They've got some sort of trepidation. Whereas I guarantee you, almost all pastors have said no to the call before they said yes. Almost every prophet in here says no before they say yes. But I think that there's this feeling amongst, at least the feeling within the church community, where you have to say yes immediately, or you're somehow lesser than. And then I think that the other result of that is people who answer yes because they think that the church expects them to answer yes because that's the only thing they've ever heard, and they're not ready to be sent. Isaiah has to have the coal touch his lips. He has to have his heart stilled before he's ready to be sent. And I think there's great damage done when we don't wait for that. Our psalm reading is Psalm 138. This is a psalm listed of David. I give thanks to you with all my heart, Lord. I sing your praise before all other gods. I bow toward your holy temple and thank your name for your loyal love and faithfulness, because you have made your name and word greater than everything else. On the day I cried out to you, you answered me. You encouraged me with inner strength. Let all the earth's rulers give thanks to you, Lord, when they hear what you say. Let them sing to the Lord about the Lord's ways, because the Lord's glory is so great. Even though the Lord is high, he can still see the lowly. But God keeps his distance from the arrogant. Whenever I am in deep trouble, you make me live again. You send your power against my enemy's wrath. You save me with your strong hand. The Lord will do all this for my sake. Your faithful love lasts forever, Lord. Don't let go of what your hands have made. So this is a psalm of thanksgiving. It says of David, it's toward the end of the book, but the psalms are somewhat out of order occasionally. But I hear in this psalm an older David. This is a David who's had trials. He's had tribulations. He's had struggles. He's had sin. He's had moments where he was in distress. He's in deep trouble. He's had that in his past, and he's remembering now that the Lord was always there with him, even when he was in trouble, even when he was, stuck in the wilderness, living in caves, hiding from King Saul. He's remembering back that God was there. When his own children were turning against him, he's remembering back that God was still with him in the midst of the trial and tribulation. It has in it the wisdom and inner strength of an older David. And I think it's a good psalm to keep in the back of your mind when you're looking for something maybe to pray. You don't have words. Lifting this up might be a pretty good psalm to read in times of distress and to pray in times of distress. Certainly, you don't have to make up all your prayers. You can pull them from here sometimes, and I think this is a good psalm. I like it. Our epistle or letter reading is 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 1 through 11. Paul reading. Brothers and sisters, I want to call your attention to the good news that I preached to you, which you also received and in which you stand. You are being saved. You are being saved through it if you hold on to the message I preached to you, unless somehow you believed it for nothing. I passed on to you as most important, what I also received. Christ died for our sins in line with the Scriptures. He was buried and he rose on the third day in line with the Scriptures. He appeared to Cephas, the 12, and then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at once. Most of them are still alive to this day, though some have died. Then he appeared to James and to all the apostles, and last of all he appeared to me, as if I was born at the wrong time. I am the least important of the apostles. I don't deserve to be called an apostle because I harassed God's church. I am what I am by God's grace, and God's grace hasn't been for nothing. In fact, I have worked harder than all the others. That is, it wasn't me, but the grace of God that is with me. So then whether you heard the message from me or them, this is what we preach, and this is what you have believed. So this is headed the resurrection in the Scriptures, but I read this particularly paired up with the other stories in this particular week of the lectionary, I read this as Paul's call story. That he's talking about how he was called, how he had persecuted the church, and then of course we have the Damascus Road experience in the book of Acts, where Paul is knocked down and he's blinded, and he has to learn. He receives from Ananias the good news there in Damascus, and then he's converted. He changes sides. He begins his own ministry, and I think that what strikes me is that Paul, known as the apostle, like the apostle, known as the one who starts churches, who shares the good news, who does all this stuff for all of his ministry. And when he talks about it, he says that he passed on to this church what he had received. And so often I think that we forget that even the best sharers, right, even the best evangelists receive. They received the good news at some point, and frankly, the best sharers, the best preachers, the best evangelists receive constantly. That you have to be filled in order to give. And I think that sometimes we focus so much on the sharing, we focus so much on outside, that we do sometimes forget to receive. Paul passed on what he had received. And I think for many of us, at least in my experience, we have to continue to receive it. We have to continue to believe it. We have to continue to understand the message, or else we lose part of what we were. And that's just what stuck out to me in that reading today. Finally, our gospel reading is Luke chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. We skipped Jesus setting up a base in Capernaum outside Peter's house. We've gone to the calling of the first few other disciples. One day Jesus was standing beside Lake Gennesaret when the crowd pressed in around him to hear God's word. Jesus saw two boats sitting by the lake. The fishermen had gone ashore and were washing their nets. Jesus boarded one of the boats, the one that had belonged to Simon, and asked him to row out a little distance from the shore. Jesus sat down and taught the crowds from the boat. When he finished speaking to the crowds, he said to Simon, "Row out further into the deep water and drop your nets for a catch." Simon replied, "Master, we've worked hard all night and caught nothing. But because you say so, I'll drop the nets." So they dropped their nets, and their catch was so huge that their nets were splitting. They signaled for their partners in the other boat to come and help them. They filled both boats so full they were about to sink. When Simon Peter saw the catch, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Leave me, Lord, for I am a sinner." Peter and those with him were overcome with amazement because of the number of fish they caught. James and John, Zebedee's sons, were Simon's partners, and they were amazed too. Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on you will be fishing for people." As soon as they brought the boats to shore, they left everything and followed Jesus. So I actually preached on this story a couple months ago, so we'll look at other things here. But I think that, once again, what we see here is we see a call story. And I want to kind of look at an overall grouping, right? The prophet Isaiah, in the Old Testament times, receives a vision, a vision of a heavenly forces and coal taken from the altar, pressed on his lips. This is massive thing, right? This big, huge thing that's pretty big call story with a vision and everything. And then we see Paul. Paul gets kind of chastised and brought to his knees, literally, on the road to Damascus, and he realizes that he is lesser than that, right? He realizes that he is called, but called as one, outside of time, untimely born, he says. And we see it's a very different call story, but a call story that he needs to be able to turn around his life from one of persecuting the church to one of being an apostle for the church. And then we see the disciples here, right, where they're just out fishing, and they receive the message from Jesus, and then Jesus says, "Let's go fishing." And they catch this big, huge catch, and then all of a sudden that's what brings them to understanding what Jesus is wanting for them, and they leave their boats and their big catch, and they follow Jesus. And what I'm struck by here is that God doesn't follow one way of calling people. That God doesn't follow one method. There's not one story of a call of God, and that God is calling each of these individuals through something that speaks to them, and that God is doing it through their lives and something that's meaningful for them. And I think that too often we focus so hard and heavy on these big, huge call stories, big, huge stories of salvation and being saved from multiple addictions and or jail time or whatever, and then some of us would compare that with our own stories and go, well, that's not what happened to me. These people must be greater than I, which is kind of what Paul was talking about the last couple of weeks when he was talking about the spiritual gifts and how we shouldn't be focused on having a better spiritual gift than another. Is God works in each of us in different ways, and each of us in ways that speak to us. And just because our call story isn't big and flashy, doesn't have an angel carrying coal from the altar and touching our lips, doesn't mean our call story isn't valid. We just might have gone fishing with Jesus, but that's a call story that's still valid. As long as we are feeling that call, and others have, certainly if others have identified that call as true in their hearts and their souls as well, it's valid. And that's the way God works in the world, that we should not be afraid to share a story that we think is smaller. Thank you for watching this devotion all the way through to this point. My hope and my prayer is that you have gathered something from this, and that you have that God has spoken to you at some point during this. If God has spoken to you, if you have gotten something from this devotion, please do comment down below. It really does help this devotion be seen by as many people as possible. Please do react on Facebook or YouTube. Comment down below and let me know what spoke to you and what you love about this series. As always, thank you for watching, and may God be with you until we meet again.